Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her flight suit one final time as she walked across the tarmac toward her F-16 Fighting Falcon. The pre-dawn darkness was broken only by the harsh white lights illuminating the aircraft, casting long shadows across the concrete. At 28 years old, she had logged over 1,200 hours in the cockpit. But something about this morning felt different. The usual chatter among the ground crew was notably absent, replaced by an almost funeral-like silence that made her stomach tighten with unease. The mission briefing had been unlike anything she'd experienced in her 6 years as an Air Force pilot. Instead of the typical conference room filled with her squadron mates, she'd been called to a secure facility where men in dark suits sat alongside her commanding officers. The words, classified, immediate threat, and nuclear materials, had been repeated so often they seemed to echo in her mind even now. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she performed her pre-flight inspection, running through the checklist that had become second nature. She checked the control surfaces, verified the weapons systems, and examined every inch of the aircraft that would soon carry her into what everyone acknowledged was likely a one-way mission. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. The threat had emerged from intelligence reports that seemed almost too terrifying to believe. A rogue terrorist cell had somehow acquired weapons-grade plutonium and was transporting it across the desert in a heavily armored convoy. Their destination was a major metropolitan area where they planned to detonate a crude nuclear device. The blast itself would kill hundreds of thousands, but the radioactive contamination would make entire city districts uninhabitable for decades. Conventional military responses had already failed. Ground forces couldn't reach the convoy in time, and satellite imagery showed the terrorists had sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons. The convoy was moving through a narrow canyon where the rocky walls would channel and amplify a nuclear explosion, making the potential devastation even worse. Every passing minute brought them closer to populated areas where intervention would become impossible. Sarah climbed into her cockpit, her movements automatic despite the chaos of thoughts racing through her mind. The familiar smell of jet fuel and electronics surrounded her as she began the engine startup sequence. The F-16's single Pratt & Whitney turbofan engine came to life with a reassuring roar. But even that sound couldn't calm her nerves completely. The plan was as desperate as it was dangerous. Sarah would fly at extremely low altitude to avoid the convoy's radar systems, then deliver a precisely targeted strike that would destroy the nuclear materials without causing a nuclear detonation. The physics were complicated, but the weapons experts had assured her it was theoretically possible, the key word being theoretically. Her radio crackled to life as the control tower cleared her for takeoff. Sarah pushed the throttle forward and felt the familiar surge of power as the F-16 accelerated down the runway. Within seconds, she was airborne, climbing rapidly into the star-filled sky. Behind her, the lights of the airbase grew smaller until they disappeared entirely. The flight to the intercept point would take 47 minutes at maximum speed. Sarah used every second to review the mission parameters, checking and rechecking her navigation systems and weapons targeting computers. She had only one chance to get this right, and failure would mean catastrophe on a scale that kept national security officials awake at night. As she flew through the darkness, Sarah's thoughts drifted to the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in a small farming town in Iowa, she'd always been fascinated by aircraft. Her father had been a crop duster, and some of her earliest memories involved watching him pilot his small plane across the fields surrounding their home. When she told her parents she wanted to become a military pilot, they'd been supportive but worried about the dangers she would face. The journey hadn't been easy. Flight school had pushed her to her physical and mental limits, and she'd faced skepticism from some instructors who questioned whether women belonged in fighter cockpits. Sarah had responded by outperforming most of her male classmates, earning respect through skill and determination rather than trying to prove any political point. She simply loved flying and wanted to serve her country. Now, racing through the darkness toward an almost certain confrontation with death, Sarah wondered if her parents were awake back in Iowa. They had no idea their daughter was about to attempt something that military historians would later compare to the most desperate missions of World War II. The secrecy surrounding the operation meant her family wouldn't learn about it until much later, if at all. The terrain below began to change as Sarah approached the target area. The flat farmland gave way to rolling hills, then rocky desert punctuated by deep canyons and mesas. According to intelligence reports, the convoy was following an old smuggling route that wound through some of the most remote and desolate country in the southwestern United States. It was perfect terrain for hiding from conventional surveillance, but it also meant Sarah would be operating far from any possible rescue if something went wrong. Her radar warning receiver remained silent as she descended to treetop level, using the natural terrain to mask her approach. The F-16 wasn't designed for this type of low-level penetration mission. But Sarah had trained extensively in terrain-following flight. She skimmed over ridgelines and dove into valleys, following the contours of the landscape like a bird of prey hunting its target. 20 minutes from the intercept point, Sarah's radio reception began to deteriorate as the canyon walls interfered with communications. Her last contact with command was a terse continue mission, followed by static. From this point forward, she would be operating entirely on her own judgment, with no possibility of calling for backup or receiving updated intelligence. The isolation was both terrifying and liberating. Sarah had always performed best when she could rely on her own skills and instincts, rather than following orders from people who weren't in the cockpit. Now, with the weight of millions of lives depending on her actions, she felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. This was what she had trained for, even if no one had imagined circumstances quite this extreme. Sarah's targeting system began picking up heat signatures ahead as she rounded a sharp bend in the canyon. The convoy appeared on her display as a line of bright dots moving slowly along the winding road below. Intelligence estimates had been accurate. She counted 6 vehicles in a tight formation, with what appeared to be heavy weapons mounted on several of them. Getting close enough for an accurate strike would mean exposing herself to concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple directions. The nuclear material was being transported in a specially modified truck in the center of the convoy. Destroying it without triggering a nuclear reaction required surgical precision that pushed the limits of both her equipment and her abilities. Too much explosive force could scatter radioactive material over a wide area, while too little might allow the terrorists to recover the plutonium and continue their mission. Sarah armed her weapons systems and began her attack approach, diving toward the convoy at over 400 miles per hour. The canyon walls flashed past her wingtips as she lined up her targeting system, knowing she would have perhaps 2 seconds to acquire the target and fire before defensive weapons could track her. In those 2 seconds, the fate of hundreds of thousands of innocent people would be decided. As she committed to the attack run, Sarah felt time slow down in the way it always did during moments of extreme danger. Every detail became crystal clear. The way sunlight reflected off the truck's armored hull, the puffs of dust kicked up by the convoy's wheels, the sudden flash of muzzle blasts as the terrorists opened fire with everything they had. Her training took over, and her hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, making minute adjustments to ensure her weapons would find their target. The distance closed rapidly, and Sarah could see individual figures scrambling around the vehicles below. Some were manning weapons while others seemed to be trying to unload cargo from the central truck. The realization that they might be attempting to deploy the nuclear device early sent a chill down her spine. There was no time for a second approach. This attack had to succeed, no matter what happened to her in the process. Sarah's finger found the trigger as her targeting system achieved lock-on. The mission that had begun in darkness and secrecy was about to reach its climax in the brilliant sunlight of a desert canyon, where a young pilot from Iowa would either save millions of lives or die trying. In the split second before she fired, Sarah thought of her parents, her fellow pilots, and all the people going about their normal lives in the city that lay beyond the mountains. They would never know how close they had come to unspeakable tragedy, or how much depended on the skill and courage of one woman flying a fighter jet through a narrow canyon at the edge of the world. Sarah's missiles streaked toward the convoy with deadly precision. But even as she watched them track toward their target, she knew her troubles were just beginning. The canyon erupted in a chaos of explosions and gunfire, as every weapon in the terrorist convoy opened up on her F-16. Tracer rounds created brilliant streaks of light that crisscrossed the air around her aircraft, and she could hear the metallic ping of bullets striking her fuselage. The first missile found its mark, striking the armored truck carrying the nuclear material with devastating force. The explosion was massive, sending a column of flame and smoke hundreds of feet into the air. Sarah banked sharply to avoid flying through the debris field, pulling so many G-forces that her vision began to tunnel, and her breathing became labored. Through the smoke and chaos, she caught a glimpse of the truck's burning wreckage scattered across the canyon floor. Her second missile had targeted a heavy weapons vehicle at the rear of the convoy, and its destruction eliminated the most serious anti-aircraft threat. But the remaining vehicles continued to pour fire in her direction, and Sarah realized she couldn't escape the canyon the way she'd entered it. The walls were too steep for a vertical climb, and the narrow confines didn't allow for the wide turns her heavily loaded F-16 needed to reverse course safely. Warning lights began flashing on her instrument panel as damage accumulated from the intense ground fire. Her hydraulic pressure was dropping, making the controls increasingly sluggish and unresponsive. Fuel was leaking from punctured tanks, creating a vapor trail that would make her easy to track if any enemy aircraft were in the area. Most seriously, her engine temperature was climbing toward the red line, suggesting that cooling lines had been severed by gunfire. Sarah pushed the F-16 to its limits as she raced through the winding canyon, staying as low as possible to use the terrain for protection. But the canyon was like a natural funnel that channeled and amplified the sound of her jet engine, making stealth impossible. Behind her, she could see vehicles from the convoy attempting to pursue along the rough road, though they had no hope of matching her speed. The bigger concern was the radio traffic she was intercepting on enemy frequencies. The attack had clearly been expected, and terrorist cells throughout the region were being alerted to her presence. Sarah's radio receiver picked up multiple conversations in Arabic and Farsi, and while she couldn't understand the specific words, the urgent tone suggested that a coordinated response was being organized. Her navigation system showed she was still more than 200 miles from friendly territory, with no chance of reaching her home base before her fuel ran out. The original mission plan had assumed she would be shot down during the attack, but now that she had somehow survived the strike, she faced the challenge of making it home with a damaged aircraft and limited options for emergency landing sites. The canyon began to widen as Sarah followed its winding path deeper into the desert. The increased maneuvering room was welcome, but it also meant she was more visible to ground-based threats. Her radar warning receiver began picking up search signals from surface-to-air missile sites that the intelligence briefing had warned might be present in the area. The terrorists had apparently prepared for the possibility of airstrikes and had positioned advanced weapons systems at strategic locations. Sarah's training had covered emergency procedures for every conceivable situation, but nothing had quite prepared her for trying to navigate hostile territory in a severely damaged fighter aircraft. She had to balance speed against fuel consumption, altitude against visibility, and direct routing against the need to avoid known threats. Every decision carried life or death consequences, and she had to make them while dealing with increasingly difficult flight controls. The engine temperature continued to climb despite her efforts to manage the cooling system. Sarah realized she was facing the possibility of catastrophic engine failure at any moment, which would force her to eject over enemy territory. The thought of capture by terrorists who had just watched her destroy their nuclear weapon was almost too terrifying to contemplate. She had been briefed on the enhanced interrogation techniques used by extremist groups and knew that female prisoners faced particular horrors. Her fuel gauge showed that she had perhaps 30 minutes of flying time remaining under current consumption rates. But the engine damage was causing her to burn fuel faster than normal, and the constant maneuvering required to avoid threats was using even more. Sarah began calculating possible landing sites, trying to identify any location where she might set the aircraft down and have a chance of survival until rescue forces could reach her. The desert below offered few options. The terrain was mostly rocky and uneven, punctuated by deep arroyos, and scattered with boulders that would destroy any aircraft attempting an emergency landing. Sarah spotted a few relatively flat areas, but they were small and surrounded by obstacles that made approach and landing extremely dangerous. Her best chance might be to aim for a straight stretch of desert highway, assuming she could find one that wasn't controlled by hostile forces. As she flew deeper into enemy territory, Sarah's radio began picking up communications from what sounded like military units coordinating a search pattern. The voices were speaking English with American accents, and for a moment her heart leaped with hope that rescue forces were already looking for her. But as she listened more carefully, she realized these were mercenaries or contractors working with the terrorist network, possibly former military personnel who had been recruited for their technical expertise. The presence of American-trained personnel working with the enemy added another layer of complexity to her situation. These individuals would know standard Air Force procedures and might be able to predict her likely escape routes. They would also be familiar with F-16 capabilities and limitations, making them far more dangerous opponents than conventional terrorist fighters. Sarah's hands were beginning to cramp from the constant pressure required to control her damaged aircraft. The hydraulic assist that normally made the F-16's controls light and responsive was failing, forcing her to use manual reversion that required significant physical strength. Every control input demanded her full attention and effort, making it difficult to monitor her instruments and maintain situational awareness. The canyon system she was following began to branch into multiple tributaries, offering different possible escape routes but also creating opportunities for ambush. Sarah chose the path that seemed to lead most directly toward friendly territory, but she knew that her enemies might be using her predictable routing to position forces ahead of her. The chess match between hunter and hunted was becoming increasingly complex as both sides tried to anticipate the other's moves. Her radar warning receiver suddenly lit up with threat indicators as multiple surface-to-air missile sites began tracking her aircraft. The distinctive warbling tone filled her headset, indicating that at least 3 different SAM systems had achieved lock-on and were preparing to fire. Sarah immediately began evasive maneuvers, diving toward the canyon floor and dispensing chaff and flares to confuse the incoming missiles. The first missile streaked past her canopy close enough that she could see the white-hot exhaust flame. Sarah pulled into a punishing high-G turn that stressed her damaged aircraft to its limits, feeling rivets pop and metal groan under the strain. Her vision grayed out from the acceleration forces, but she maintained consciousness through sheer willpower and the breathing techniques she had learned during G-force training. A second missile exploded close enough to shower her aircraft with shrapnel, punching dozens of small holes through the fuselage and wings. Sarah felt the F-16 shudder and yaw as asymmetric damage affected its aerodynamics. Her engine temperature spiked into the danger zone, and warning tones began sounding throughout the cockpit. She was running out of time and options as mechanical failures cascaded through her aircraft's systems. Through her helmet's visor, Sarah caught sight of something that made her heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. On a ridge overlooking the canyon, she could see vehicles positioned in what looked like an observation post. But these weren't the crude technical vehicles used by most terrorist groups. They appeared to be professionally military equipment, possibly including advanced communications gear that could coordinate the manhunt spreading across the desert. The presence of sophisticated enemy forces suggested that the nuclear smuggling operation had been far more extensive than intelligence agencies had realized. This wasn't just a small terrorist cell, but potentially part of a larger network with significant resources and professional military support. Sarah's successful strike against the convoy might have prevented one attack, but it could also have exposed her to retaliation from a much more dangerous enemy than anyone had anticipated. As she raced through the desert landscape with her damaged fighter, Sarah began to understand that her mission was far from over. Destroying the nuclear material had been only the first challenge. Now she faced the equally daunting task of surviving long enough to report what she had discovered about the true scope of the threat. The information she carried in her head might be as valuable as the plutonium she had just destroyed, and her enemies would do anything to prevent that intelligence from reaching American commanders. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, offering both opportunity for escape and countless places for ambush. Sarah's fuel was running dangerously low. Her aircraft was falling apart around her, and enemy forces were closing in from multiple directions. But she was still alive, still flying, and still fighting. The girl from Iowa who had dreamed of soaring through open skies now found herself in a deadly game of survival where every second counted and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah's engine finally gave up the fight with a grinding mechanical shriek that she felt through the entire airframe. One moment she was flying a wounded but controllable fighter jet, and the next she was piloting a 20-ton glider with the aerodynamic properties of a falling brick. The sudden silence in her cockpit was deafening after hours of engine noise, broken only by the whistle of air rushing past her damaged canopy and the urgent beeping of warning systems throughout the aircraft. She had perhaps 3 minutes of gliding time before she would be forced to eject or attempt a dead-stick landing in the desert below. Sarah's training kicked in as she began scanning for any possible landing site while simultaneously running through emergency procedures that she had practiced hundreds of times but never hoped to use in combat. Her hands moved automatically across the cockpit controls, shutting down fuel systems to prevent fire and configuring the aircraft for minimum glide speed. The terrain below was even more forbidding than it had appeared from altitude. What had looked like relatively smooth desert from above revealed itself to be a maze of rocky outcroppings, deep gullies, and scattered boulders that would destroy any aircraft attempting to land. Sarah's eyes swept desperately across the landscape, searching for any flat area large enough to accommodate her F-16's gliding approach. In the distance, she spotted what appeared to be an old mining road cut into the desert floor. It was arrow straight for perhaps 2 miles before disappearing into a range of low hills, but it looked barely wide enough for her aircraft's wingspan. Landing on such a narrow surface would require precision that pushed the limits of possibility, especially with damaged flight controls and no engine power for a go-around if she misjudged the approach. Sarah committed to the attempt, knowing she had no other choice. She banked toward the road and began configuring her aircraft for the emergency landing, lowering her landing gear and extending flaps to give herself the slowest possible approach speed. The damaged hydraulics made every control input a struggle, and she could feel the F-16 wanting to roll uncontrollably as asymmetric damage affected its handling characteristics. As she descended toward the makeshift runway, Sarah caught sight of vehicles racing across the desert toward her projected landing point. The enemy forces that had been hunting her were converging on her location, apparently having calculated her likely flight path after the engine failure. She would have perhaps minutes on the ground before they reached her position, assuming she survived the landing attempt. The approach required every skill she had developed over thousands of hours in the cockpit. With no engine power, she had only one chance to get the landing right. Too high and she would overshoot the narrow road into the rocky terrain beyond. Too low and she would crash short of the landing area. Sarah fought the damaged controls as crosswinds tried to push her off the narrow approach path, making constant corrections that sent pain shooting through her arms and shoulders. At the last moment, an unexpected gust of wind caught her damaged aircraft and slammed it toward the ground, faster than anticipated. Sarah pulled back on the stick with all her strength, feeling the airframe groan under the stress as she tried to arrest her descent. The F-16 hit the desert road hard enough to collapse the main landing gear and send her skidding along the rocky surface in a shower of sparks and flying debris. The aircraft slid for what felt like miles but was probably only a few hundred yards before coming to rest against a low ridge of stone. Sarah sat stunned in her cockpit for a moment, hardly believing she was still alive. Her helmet had cracked against the canopy during the impact, and she could taste blood in her mouth, but she appeared to have avoided any serious injuries. The smell of fuel and hot metal filled her nostrils as she began the process of shutting down her aircraft's remaining systems. Emergency egress training had emphasized the importance of getting clear of a crashed aircraft as quickly as possible due to fire danger. Sarah released her harness and canopy, then climbed out onto the wing and dropped to the desert floor. Her legs were shaky from adrenaline and the physical stress of the landing, but she forced herself to move away from the wreckage and begin assessing her situation. The F-16 was clearly a total loss, with one wing completely torn away and the fuselage cracked in multiple places. Fuel was leaking from ruptured tanks, creating a spreading pool that would ignite if any spark reached it. Sarah retrieved her survival kit and sidearm from the cockpit, knowing that she was now dependent on her own skills and the limited equipment she could carry to stay alive in hostile territory. Her survival radio had been damaged in the crash, leaving her with no way to contact rescue forces or report her position. The GPS unit in her emergency kit was still functional, showing that she was approximately 180 miles from the nearest friendly base. Crossing that distance on foot through desert terrain while being hunted by enemy forces seemed almost impossible. But she had no other options available. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder as Sarah moved away from her crashed aircraft. She could see dust clouds in several directions, suggesting that multiple groups were converging on her location from different routes. Her best chance for survival lay in reaching the rocky hills before the search teams arrived, where she could use the broken terrain to hide and evade pursuit. Sarah began jogging toward the hills, carrying her survival kit and trying to pace herself for what might be a very long journey. The desert heat was already becoming uncomfortable, and she knew it would become deadly as the day progressed. Water would be her most critical resource, and she had only the small supply included in her emergency kit, plus whatever she might be able to find along the way. Behind her, the first enemy vehicles reached the crash site. Sarah could hear shouting and the sound of men spreading out to search the surrounding area. She pushed herself to move faster, knowing that every minute of lead time might make the difference between escape and capture. The rocky terrain of the hills offered concealment, but it would also slow her movement and make navigation more difficult. As she climbed into the foothills, Sarah began to understand the full scope of the challenge facing her. The mountains stretched for dozens of miles in every direction, offering countless hiding places but also unlimited opportunities to become lost or trapped. She had basic survival training and emergency equipment, but nothing had prepared her for trying to evade a large-scale manhunt while crossing some of the most hostile terrain in North America. Her military maps showed a few small towns scattered throughout the region, but most were probably controlled by the same network that had been transporting the nuclear material. Sarah couldn't risk approaching any settlement without knowing whether it was friendly or hostile, and her communications equipment was too damaged to establish contact with potential allies. The psychological challenges were almost as daunting as the physical ones. Sarah had gone from being in complete control of a sophisticated fighter aircraft to being a fugitive on foot with limited resources and no backup plan. The isolation was profound, and she found herself fighting off waves of panic as the reality of her situation began to sink in. From her position in the hills, Sarah could see search teams spreading out across the desert in an organized grid pattern. They were clearly professionals who knew how to conduct a thorough manhunt, not the disorganized militia forces she might have hoped to encounter. Several helicopters had joined the search, making her concealment even more critical. Any movement in the open would likely be spotted immediately. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah worked her way deeper into the mountains, following game trails and dry creek beds to avoid leaving obvious tracks. Her flight suit was designed for the controlled environment of a cockpit, not for hiking through rough terrain, and she could already feel blisters forming where the material rubbed against her skin. Every step was a reminder that she was far from her element and completely dependent on resources she wasn't sure would sustain her. The enemy search pattern suggested they expected her to try heading directly toward friendly territory, so Sarah decided to move parallel to the border instead. This would take her through even more remote terrain, but it might allow her to avoid the heaviest concentration of hostile forces. She would need to find water and shelter soon, as the desert nights could be as deadly as the scorching days. As darkness approached, Sarah found a concealed position among the rocks, where she could rest and plan her next moves. The sounds of the search were growing more distant, but she knew the respite was temporary. Her enemies had patience and resources, and they understood how much she had learned about their operations. They would not give up the hunt easily, and she would need every advantage she could gain to stay ahead of them. Looking up at the star-filled sky that had once been her domain as a pilot, Sarah felt a deep longing for the safety and power of her aircraft. But she was still alive, still free, and still carrying intelligence that could help prevent future attacks. The mission that had begun with a desperate strike against a nuclear convoy was now evolving into something even more challenging. A test of survival that would push her beyond every limit she had ever known. The desert night was cold and unforgiving, but Sarah wrapped herself in her survival blanket and settled in to wait for dawn, knowing that tomorrow would bring new dangers and new opportunities for both escape and disaster. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of helicopters in the distance, their rotors cutting through the thin mountain air with a mechanical rhythm that sent a chill through her exhausted body. She had managed perhaps 3 hours of restless sleep, constantly awakened by the sounds of search teams moving through the surrounding terrain. Her hiding place among the rocks had provided concealment, but little comfort, and every muscle in her body ached from the crash landing and the subsequent climb into the mountains. The water in her survival kit was already running low, and Sarah knew she would need to find a reliable source soon or face dehydration in the brutal desert heat. Her military training had covered basic wilderness survival, but the theoretical knowledge was proving inadequate for the harsh reality of staying alive while being hunted by professional trackers with unlimited resources and sophisticated equipment. As the eastern horizon began to lighten, Sarah carefully studied the terrain ahead through a small pair of binoculars from her survival kit. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, offering both sanctuary and the potential for becoming hopelessly lost. She could see several possible routes through the broken landscape, but each presented its own dangers and uncertainties. Movement in the valley below caught her attention, and Sarah focused her binoculars on what appeared to be a convoy of vehicles following the same rough road where she had crashed her F-16. The searchers were being methodical and thorough, leaving nothing to chance as they expanded their dragnet through the surrounding area. She counted at least a dozen vehicles, plus the helicopters that continued to circle overhead in overlapping search patterns. Sarah decided to move deeper into the mountains rather than try to circle back toward friendlier territory. The pursuing forces clearly expected her to head directly for the nearest American base, and they were concentrating their search along the most likely escape routes. By going deeper into the wilderness, she might be able to avoid the main search effort and find an unexpected way out of the mountains. The climb became increasingly difficult as Sarah worked her way up steep rocky slopes that seemed designed to break ankles and shred equipment. Her flight suit was already showing signs of wear from scrambling over sharp stones, and she could feel the beginning of serious blisters on her feet. Every step required careful planning to avoid dislodging loose rocks that might alert searchers to her presence. After several hours of climbing, Sarah reached a high ridge that offered a commanding view of the surrounding area. What she saw made her heart sink with despair. The search effort was far more extensive than she had imagined, with multiple aircraft and dozens of ground vehicles spread across the entire region. This wasn't just a local operation, but a coordinated response involving significant resources and professional military capabilities. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see roadblocks being established at key points throughout the mountain range. The enemy forces were systematically closing off escape routes and tightening their noose around the area where they believed she was hiding. Time was running out for any chance of slipping through their lines undetected. But the elevated position also revealed something that offered a glimmer of hope. Far to the north, Sarah could make out what appeared to be an old mining facility built into the side of a mountain. The complex looked abandoned, but it might offer shelter and possibly even supplies left behind by previous occupants. More importantly, it was located in a direction that the search teams didn't seem to be covering as intensively. The journey to reach the mining facility would require crossing several exposed valleys where she would be vulnerable to aerial observation. Sarah would need to move only during periods of poor visibility, using weather and terrain to mask her movements from the helicopters that continued to patrol overhead. She settled down to wait for the right opportunity, conserving her energy and water while studying the route ahead. As the afternoon heat intensified, Sarah found herself fighting off waves of exhaustion and dehydration. The thin air at high altitude made every breath an effort, and the combination of physical stress and psychological pressure was taking a severe toll on her body. She rationed her remaining water carefully, knowing that each sip brought her closer to a crisis that could prove fatal. Late in the afternoon, a line of thunderstorms began building over the western peaks, offering the possibility of both concealment and desperately needed water. Sarah prepared to move as soon as the weather reached her position, gathering her equipment and planning the most efficient route to the abandoned mining facility. The approaching storm would limit the effectiveness of the search aircraft, but it would also make travel much more dangerous on the exposed mountain slopes. The first drops of rain began falling just as Sarah started her descent into the valley below her hiding place. She spread her survival blanket to catch as much water as possible, drinking what she could and filling her small water container. The rain was a mixed blessing, providing concealment and hydration, while also making the rocky terrain treacherously slippery. As she moved through the storm, Sarah could hear the helicopters being forced to land or retreat to safer areas. The sudden silence, after hours of constant engine noise, was almost eerie. But it gave her the first real opportunity to move, without fear of immediate detection. She pushed herself to cover as much ground as possible while the weather provided protection. The storm intensified as Sarah crossed the exposed valley floor, forcing her to seek shelter under rocky overhangs several times when lightning strikes became dangerously close. Each delay ate away at her window of opportunity, but attempting to continue across open ground during an electrical storm would be suicide. She used the forced stops to rest and plan her approach to the mining facility. When the storm finally passed, Sarah found herself only a few miles from her objective. The abandoned mining complex looked even more promising up close, with multiple buildings and what appeared to be heavy equipment that might provide both shelter and useful supplies. But she also noticed fresh tire tracks leading to the facility, suggesting that it might not be as abandoned as it had appeared from a distance. Sarah approached the complex cautiously, using natural cover to observe the buildings for signs of activity. After an hour of careful surveillance, she was reasonably confident that the facility was unoccupied, though the recent tracks suggested that someone was using it periodically. She decided to risk a closer inspection, knowing that she desperately needed shelter and supplies if she was going to survive much longer in the mountains. The main building of the mining complex was partially collapsed, but several smaller structures appeared to be in good condition. Sarah found an old storage building that offered concealment and some protection from the elements. Inside, she discovered canned food, basic tools, and even some old military surplus equipment that suggested the facility might be used as a cache or safe house by various groups operating in the remote area. Among the supplies, Sarah found a damaged radio that might be repairable with the tools available in the facility. If she could get it working, she might be able to establish contact with friendly forces and coordinate a rescue attempt. The prospect of communication with the outside world gave her the first real hope she had felt since her aircraft crashed in the desert. But even as Sarah began working on the radio, she remained acutely aware that her enemies were still searching for her with professional determination. The mining facility offered temporary refuge, but it could also become a trap if the search teams expanded their operations into this remote area. She would need to be ready to abandon her shelter at a moment's notice and continue her flight through the unforgiving mountain wilderness. As night fell over the abandoned mining complex, Sarah settled in to work on the radio, while keeping watch for any signs of approaching danger. The sounds of the search effort had grown more distant throughout the day, but she knew that her pursuers had not given up. They understood as well as she did that the intelligence she carried about their operations was worth almost any effort to obtain or eliminate. The repair work on the radio was painstaking and difficult, with limited tools and poor lighting, but Sarah persevered with the focus that had carried her through flight school and combat training. Each small success in restoring the device's functionality brought her closer to the possibility of rescue and the chance to complete her mission by delivering vital intelligence about the terrorist network she had discovered. Outside the mining complex, the desert night was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures and the distant rumble of vehicles continuing their systematic search. Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring renewed efforts to find her, possibly including searches of facilities like the one where she was hiding. Time was running out, but she was still alive, still free, and still fighting to complete a mission that had already prevented one nuclear catastrophe and might help prevent others. The mountains that had seemed like such hostile enemies were slowly becoming allies in her struggle for survival, offering both concealment and the resources she needed to stay ahead of her pursuers for at least one more day. Sarah's hands trembled with exhaustion as she made the final connection on the salvaged radio. Her fingers cramped from hours of delicate work with improvised tools in the dim light of her emergency flashlight. The ancient military surplus transceiver crackled to life, filling the abandoned mining building with static that sounded like the most beautiful music she had ever heard. After 3 days of complete isolation while being hunted across the desert mountains, the prospect of establishing contact with friendly forces seemed almost too good to be true. She had spent the entire night carefully tuning the radio and testing its capabilities, working to establish communication while staying alert for any signs that her pursuers had discovered her hiding place. The search efforts had continued throughout the previous day, with helicopters and ground vehicles maintaining their systematic sweep of the mountain region. But the remote mining facility had remained undetected, providing Sarah with the time and resources she needed to prepare for what might be her only chance at rescue. The first transmission Sarah attempted was on a standard emergency frequency monitored by military and civilian rescue services throughout the region. Her voice was hoarse from dehydration and stress as she whispered into the microphone, identifying herself by call sign and providing her approximate position coordinates. The response came almost immediately, confirming that rescue forces had been searching for her since her aircraft had been reported overdue from its classified mission. But even as Sarah felt relief flooding through her at the sound of American voices on the radio, she realized that establishing contact was only the beginning of her problems. The mountainous terrain and her remote location made helicopter extraction extremely dangerous, especially with hostile forces still active in the area. The rescue coordinator explained that they would need to establish a secure landing zone in a location that could be defended against ground attack, while providing adequate clearance for aircraft operations. Sarah studied her military maps while maintaining radio contact, looking for suitable extraction sites within reasonable walking distance of her current position. Most of the surrounding terrain was too rough or exposed for safe helicopter operations, but she identified a relatively flat meadow, approximately 5 miles to the northeast, that might work if she could reach it undetected. The journey would require crossing several ridges and valleys where she would be exposed to observation, but she had no better alternatives available. As dawn approached, Sarah prepared to abandon the mining facility that had provided crucial shelter and resources during her most desperate hours. She gathered supplies from the cache, including additional water containers, emergency rations, and a better survival kit that someone had left behind. The extra equipment would slow her movement, but it might also mean the difference between life and death if the extraction attempt failed. The radio communications had revealed troubling intelligence about the scope of the enemy response to her successful mission. Military analysts had been monitoring increased activity throughout the region, suggesting that the nuclear smuggling operation she had disrupted was part of a much larger network than originally suspected. Her survival and the intelligence she carried had become a priority target for elimination, with significant resources being devoted to preventing her from reaching friendly territory. Sarah began her movement toward the extraction site while maintaining periodic radio contact with the Rescue Coordination Center. The communications had to be brief and carefully coded to avoid revealing her location to enemy forces that might be monitoring military frequencies. Every transmission carried the risk of exposing her position, but the coordination was essential for timing the rescue attempt and ensuring that friendly forces would be in position when she reached the landing zone. The terrain between the mining facility and the extraction site proved to be even more challenging than Sarah had anticipated from studying her maps. Deep ravines and unstable rock formations forced her to take long detours that consumed precious time and energy. Her flight boots, designed for the controlled environment of an aircraft cockpit, provided little protection or support for the grueling cross-country trek through some of the most hostile wilderness in North America. Halfway to her destination, Sarah's radio crackled with an urgent warning from the rescue coordinator. Intelligence sources had detected increased enemy activity in her general area, with multiple search teams converging on the region where her transmissions had been detected. The extraction would need to be accelerated, with helicopter crews accepting higher levels of risk to reach her before hostile forces could interfere with the operation. Sarah pushed herself to move faster despite her exhaustion, knowing that the window for successful rescue was rapidly closing. Behind her, she could hear the sound of helicopters and vehicles that seemed to be getting closer with each passing hour. The professional hunters who had been pursuing her for days were finally closing in, guided by sophisticated direction-finding equipment that had tracked her radio transmissions despite her attempts at operational security. As she climbed toward the final ridge separating her from the extraction site, Sarah caught sight of aircraft approaching from the direction of friendly territory. The distinctive silhouette of American military helicopters filled her with hope and determination, even as she realized that enemy forces were also converging on the same location. The next few minutes would determine whether her ordeal would end in rescue or capture by the terrorists who had already demonstrated their willingness to use nuclear weapons against civilian targets. The extraction site came into view as Sarah crested the ridge, revealing a small mountain meadow surrounded by steep slopes that would make approach difficult for the rescue aircraft. But the helicopters were already beginning their descent, with escort gunships providing cover against possible ground attack. Sarah began running toward the landing zone, abandoning stealth in favor of speed, as hostile forces appeared on ridges throughout the surrounding area. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Sarah raced across the open meadow toward the lead helicopter. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet while the door gunners on the rescue aircraft returned fire with devastating effect. The sound was deafening as automatic weapons and helicopter rotors combined to create a chaos of noise that seemed to echo off every peak in the mountain range. Sarah reached the helicopter as its wheels touched the ground, diving through the open door into the protective embrace of the crew chief, who pulled her aboard. The aircraft immediately began climbing away from the landing zone, while escort gunships continued to suppress enemy fire from the surrounding hills. Through the cabin window, Sarah could see muzzle flashes scattered across the mountainside as her pursuers realized that their quarry was escaping after days of intensive hunting. The flight back to friendly territory took less than an hour, but it seemed like a lifetime to Sarah, as she finally allowed herself to believe that her ordeal was truly over. The crew chief provided medical attention for her injuries and dehydration, while intelligence officers began debriefing her about everything she had observed during her time behind enemy lines. The information she provided would prove crucial for understanding the scope of the terrorist network and preventing future attacks. As the helicopter approached the airbase where Sarah's mission had begun days earlier, she could see crowds of personnel gathered on the flight line to welcome her home. Her successful strike against the nuclear convoy had prevented a catastrophe that could have killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people, but her survival and escape had provided intelligence that might prevent even larger attacks in the future. The medical team that met the helicopter rushed Sarah to the base hospital for evaluation and treatment. But her physical injuries proved to be relatively minor compared to the psychological impact of her experiences. She had been pushed beyond every limit she had ever imagined, facing challenges that had tested not just her technical skills as a pilot, but her fundamental ability to survive under impossible conditions. In the days that followed, Sarah learned that her mission had been even more successful than she had realized. The intelligence she had gathered during her escape had led to coordinated strikes against terrorist facilities throughout the region, rolling up a network that intelligence agencies had been trying to penetrate for years. The nuclear material she had destroyed in the desert canyon had been only a small part of a much larger operation that posed an ongoing threat to national security. Military historians would later compare Sarah's mission to the most desperate and heroic operations of previous wars, but she found it difficult to think of herself as a hero. She had simply done her job as a military pilot, using her training and determination to complete a mission that circumstances had made far more complicated than anyone could have anticipated. The farm girl from Iowa who had dreamed of flying had found herself tested by challenges that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Sarah returned to flight status after several weeks of recovery and debriefing, but she carried with her a profound understanding of how quickly circumstances could transform a routine mission into a test of survival. Her experience had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to continue fighting even when every rational calculation suggested that defeat was inevitable. The medal ceremony that followed her recovery was attended by senior officials from throughout the military and intelligence communities, recognizing not just her successful completion of the nuclear interdiction mission, but her extraordinary survival and evasion in hostile territory. But for Sarah, the greatest reward was simply the knowledge that her actions had prevented unspeakable tragedy and contributed to protecting the innocent people who would never know how close they had come to disaster. Years later, when she finally retired from military service, Sarah would often think about those desperate days in the desert mountains when everything had depended on her ability to keep moving forward despite impossible odds. The experience had changed her in fundamental ways, teaching lessons about resilience and determination that extended far beyond military aviation. She had discovered that the human spirit, when properly motivated and trained, was capable of achievements that seemed to defy the laws of physics and probability. The classified nature of her mission meant that most details would remain secret for decades, but Sarah knew that somewhere in the files of various government agencies, her story would serve as an example of what could be accomplished when duty, training, and sheer determination combined in the crucible of crisis. She had flown an F-16 on a doomed operation that averted nuclear devastation, then survived against all odds to complete a mission that ultimately saved far more lives than anyone had originally imagined possible.